First, greetings, my dear audience. Where are you from? I hope you're all well. My name is Kayla, Assistant Content Analysis from Leader Associates, and your host of today's webinar. Welcome to the Impact Live Vast Potential for Japan Offshore Wind Ambitions, also the second day of APEC Wind Energy Week 2023. With its 608 gigawatt offshore wind capacity, Japan is becoming the most attractive wind energy market in the APEC region. To unleash the momentum of this energy potential, how to quickly establish the market conditions that allow diverse domestic and foreign players to actively participate in. Today, our webinar will put a keen focus on Japan's offshore wind market, with analysis on policy, investment, finance, second offshore wind tender, and the floating wind, contributed by BloombergNEF, Development Bank of Japan, White&Case, and OWC. Also with a leaders panel, the key determinants and the successful factors that could activate Japan's offshore wind industry, joined by IJOLA, Development Bank of Japan, Brainpower Investment Corporation, Sumitomo Mistrust Bank, and OW Ocean Winds. In the meantime, we would encourage all the audience to raise with your questions in the Q&A box, as we have a fantastic industry lineup. Our colleagues on site will help direct and try to accommodate as many as possible. Last but not least, this Impact webinar is supported by the 5th edition Japan Wind Energy 2023, the physical business conference, exhibition, and tech forum that's dedicated to uniting wind value chain in Japan and across the globe. The converted key players include TEPCO Power Grid, Malubeni, Equinor, JERA, RWE Renewables, Development Bank of Japan, and more partners to be announced. We also welcome your participation. Now, without further ado, let's welcome our first guest speaker, Isshu Kikuma-san, Japan Renewable Analysis from BloombergNEF, to deliver the opening keynote, Japan's wind policy and roadmap. Let's welcome.
Thank you. Let me share my screen from my side.
Okay.
Hope everybody can my screen. Hi everyone, my name is Isshu Kikuma. I cover Japan energy market at BloombergNEF. And today I'd like to talk about Japan's global and Japan offshore wind market. And before diving into my presentation, I'd like to quickly talk about what the BloombergNEF is. The BloombergNEF, or BNEF, is a research division under Bloomberg, and our research coverage is mainly specifically targeting energy transition. So on the right, we have the commodities, and in the middle, we have the sector transition, which is basically a key sector for the energy transition. So these can be clean power, advanced transport, buildings and industry, and agriculture. We also look into cross-cutting technologies such as hydrogen and CCUS, as well as sustainability fields, including sustainable finance and also the corporate clean power procurement. Let me start my presentation with the global offshore wind market and gradually narrow down to Japan offshore wind. Today, 90% of the global emissions are covered by the countries or the markets that have considered, pledged, or legislated net zero globally. The decarbonizing power sector is one of their immediate priorities for these companies, because these countries or markets, because the decarbonizing power sector is relatively straightforward, and also renewable energy technologies are already matured. So by the end of 2021, we saw over 50 gigawatts of offshore wind projects have been installed globally on a cumulative basis. And by the end of 2035, we expect the markets to keep growing. And by the end of 2035, we actually expect the global offshore wind installations to reach over 500 gigawatts. So this is basically 10 times larger than the current market size. And then we expect the global offshore wind market to expand in more and more newer markets. So the chart here is showing the annual volume of new offshore wind builds by market. And if you look at this chart, I'd like to highlight two interesting trends that you can find from here. So the first interesting trend is the volume. So if you look at the volume of annual bursts in this decade, you see a huge growth from 2021 to 2030. So basically in 2021, we only saw about 17 gigawatt of annual installation, but by the end of this decade, we actually expect over 45 gigawatt of offshore wind projects to be installed. However, if we look at the annual volume in 2030s, we actually expect the growth to be relatively limited. And this is because scaling offshore wind market further will require expansion in supply chain, including manufacturing capacity, installation vessels, and also equipment. Another trend I would like to highlight from this chart is actually the market. So if you look at the leading markets between 2021 to, let's say, 2025, you see the leading markets are China in red, UK in dark green, and also Netherlands in light green. However, if you shift the time forward a little bit, let's say 2025 and 2030, you see a few more countries are now becoming a larger offshore wind market. So those markets can be US in blue, Germany in yellow, and also Taiwan in pink. And then if you look at the markets after 2030, you see that the bar chart actually has a lot of colors, meaning a lot of markets will be tapping into offshore wind markets globally by then. And we expect most of the projects to install bottom fixed foundations. So compared to bottom fixed technologies, we expect floating offshore wind markets to remain relatively small globally. However, we'll still expect some growth in the floating offshore wind market. Right now, most of the projects of the floating technologies are demonstrations, but we expect the market uptake around 2026 to 2027. So by the end of 2025, we expect the annual installation of the floating offshore wind projects to reach over 5 gigawatts. And the leading market for the floating offshore wind should be UK, US, Korea, and France. Unfortunately, we don't expect the Japan offshore wind market, or specifically for the floating offshore wind markets, to be relatively small on a global scale. And this is because we expect Japanese governments to choose tender sites, mainly for suitable for bottom fixed technologies in the near term. Then we think the Japanese government should start focusing more on the floating offshore wind once these suitable sites suitable for the bottom fixed technologies are running out. And I think this is a great segment to Japan wind market. And before diving to Japan specific content, I'd like to quickly introduce how each markets are doing in terms of their offshore wind targets compared to our forecast. So as you know, each market has some kind of the offshore wind target for 2030 or 2035. And we are basically comparing those targets against our forecast. So in this chart, the market with the red bars are showing the market where we expect the offshore wind target should be missed by 2030 or 2035. And the market with the green bars are basically showing the market where we expect the offshore wind market should be met. And as you can see, we expect most of the markets to actually miss their offshore wind targets unless the deployment can be accelerated. And Japan is actually one of those markets where we expect the offshore wind markets to be missed. So according to the latest strategic energy plan that Japanese government put out in 2021, the government is actually trying to install 5.7 gigawatt offshore wind projects by 2030. However, in our forecast, we only expect Japan to install over 4 gigawatt of projects. So this is our annual forecast for the Japan offshore wind. So by 2030, as I mentioned earlier, we expect about 4 gigawatt of projects to be installed. And by 2035, we actually expect about 10 gigawatt of offshore wind projects to be installed in Japan by 2035 on a cumulative basis. And before 2028, we actually expect Japan offshore wind markets to be relatively small. And most of these projects are actually funded by feed-in tariff, meaning these projects didn't have to go through the tender process. The only exception is the 17 megawatt projects that you can see for 2024. So this is actually a floating project to be developed by Toda Corp. And this was actually a part of the round one offshore wind tenders that Japan did it in 2022. And after 2028, we actually expect Japan offshore wind markets to scale and reach almost a gigawatt scale. And you might be curious why we are expecting a huge spike after 2027, even though the Japanese government already started or initiated the tender process. And this is because of the long development timeline for the offshore wind projects. So even after winning the tender process in Japan, we expect the winning consortium or the winning project developers to complete the remaining permitting process, including environmental impact assessment, close finance, and also complete the construction. We expect these processes could take another 6 to 8 years to complete or to having the projects to come online. And since I talked about offshore wind tenders, I'd like to quickly introduce the ongoing offshore wind tenders in Japan. Globally, each market has a slightly different mechanism to evaluate offshore wind projects in tenders. And some markets actually use the point scheme in which project proposals with the highest points win the tender. And the point scheme is typically consists of 2 factors. One is qualitative factor, the other one is qualitative factors. And each market has a slightly different weight on these factors. So in Japan's case, as you can see from this chart, the split between the qualitative and the quantitative factor is 50-50 split. And the chart here is showing a more detailed breakdown of the Japan offshore wind tender in round 2. So as you can see, the total points is 240, and half of it is coming from the bid prices or the quantitative factor. And the other half is obviously coming from qualitative factors. And I'd like to highlight 2 interesting criteria in the qualitative factors. So the one is the operation date, which is in orange in this chart. So this criteria is basically a new criteria implemented in round 2 offshore wind tenders in Japan. And this criteria basically evaluates how soon or how early the projects can come online compared to others. Another criteria I'd like to highlight is the green one. So this is the resilient power supply. Even though this is called resilient power supply, the main focus of this criteria is basically the use of domestic supply chain. So Japan doesn't have any explicit local content requirement, but Japanese government is trying to encourage the use of the domestic supply chain by this criteria. And the idea behind this criteria is basically that Japanese government believes that projects using domestic supply chain should be able to reduce the downtime when they have some technical issues. And I think there are lots of things that can be discussed here, but we have great speakers lined up after my session who can talk about the tenders in depth. So I'll keep it short for now, and I'll move to my last section of my presentation, which is about the policy support needed in Japan. So globally, we're expecting over 30 gigawatts of offshore wind tenders over the next 18 months. So this is a quite huge number. However, in Japan, we only expect 1 offshore wind tender at 4 sites. So this is relatively small compared to other markets. And as you may be aware, this round 2 offshore wind tender was actually initially scheduled last year. However, at the time, Japanese government was making some changes in the tender guideline, so they had to postpone the round 2 offshore wind tender to this year. And I think this is very concerning because the offshore wind tender is basically the only way of building large-scale offshore wind in Japan. And delaying offshore wind tender is basically risk Japan's emission reduction target or Japan's offshore wind deployment target. So it's very important for Japan to have big and frequent offshore wind tenders on a scheduled manner. Another point I'd like to highlight is that Japan needs to keep focusing on renewables deployment, including offshore wind, rather than trying to commercialize ammonia co-firing technology.
看这个好了是吧？看后面的几页。
So Japanese government and also some companies are actually interested in blending ammonia as fuel at coal power plants to reduce CO2 emissions. However, our economic research actually found out that this ammonia co-firing technology is actually very expensive, especially at high co-firing ratio compared to renewables. And some may argue that 20% ammonia co-firing looks cost competitive against renewables by looking at this chart. But you have to be careful because 20% ammonia co-firing only reduce CO2 emissions by 20%. So this is far from net zero. And that's why we believe Japan needs to focus on deploying renewables, including offshore wind, to decarbonize in the power sector in a more cost competitive manner. And lastly, I'd like to talk about some of the policy we're seeing in the markets, in other markets. So I think one of the policy that the biggest decarbonization policy that we are seeing in the market right now is probably the US Inflation Reduction Act. So this US Inflation Reduction Act provides a lot of tax incentives to decarbonization technologies, including offshore wind and also other types of renewable energy technologies. And also it also provides quite generous support for manufacturing, domestic manufacturing capacity for equipment of those decarbonization technologies. So with Inflation Reduction Act, we are seeing a lot of company announcements and also the company strategies looking into the US market. Similarly, in Europe, we're seeing the Repower EU plan. So the idea behind this policy is basically trying to shift away from Russia because Europe used to import a quite high volume of gas from Russia. And one way of shifting away from Russia and also reducing the dependence on Russia is basically deploying more renewables in those markets. So some markets are actually trying to simplify, also accelerating the permitting process for renewables. And I think these policies are working very well to support the uptake of renewable energies. However, in Japan, we haven't seen any policies like this to support decarbonization strategies. And we don't expect Japanese governments to implement any policies to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy in the near term this year. However, it's very important for Japan to act as soon as possible to make sure that Japan is on track for net zero, especially aligned with Paris Agreement. Since Japan is a host of the G7 summit this year, we'd like to see some aggressive policy support from the Japanese government to make sure that Japan is also on track for net zero. And I'd like to end my presentation here. Thank you so much.
Isshu-san.
Yeah.
Many thanks for your presentation. It's very informative, and actually we have a few questions that we look forward to hearing from you. The first one is, as your presentation slides show, Japan market is 5 years from maturity. So what's your expectations for the upcoming 5-year period?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think as I mentioned earlier, I think most of the project over the next 5 years will be funded by feed-in tariff. And here I'm specifically talking about the projects to be installed. So these projects won't be subject to the offshore wind tenders. However, in the meantime, in terms of the offshore wind tenders, probably we are going to see more company announcement, and next March we're going to see the result of the offshore wind tender in Japan. So I think we're going to see more and more discussion or company announcement or the company strategies talking about offshore wind from different angles.
Yeah, we understand. And the second question for you is, Is Japan at the risk of losing interest from global offshore wind developers because of slow progress in with market development? And what's the number one factor you'd say to regain the interest, or what's advice you can offer for wind developers?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest risks is probably some things I mentioned in my presentation. So the first one would be delaying auction or the delaying offshore wind tender will be the risk, because this is the only way of building large-scale offshore wind projects in Japan. So it's important for Japan to have the auction on time. And also in the last auction for the ongoing tender, Japanese government actually had to come up with a lot of changes in the tender guideline. And I think this could be risky, because changing a lot of things in the tender, basically meaning all the developers or all the companies involved in the projects needs to restructure their bidding strategies or any strategies around offshore wind. So it's very important to have the consistent tender guideline that Japan can pursue, so that Japan can reduce the development risk of those offshore wind projects.
Thanks for your answering and your analysis on Japan's wind and the roadmap. Meanwhile, we also welcome audience to raise with your questions in the Q&A box. Now let's welcome our second speaker, Tomohiro Saito, Senior Vice President from Development Bank of Japan, to deliver the next keynote, Upscaling Investment and Finance for Japan's Growing Offshore Wind Power Sector. Saito.
Thank you, Carla. Can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Carla, for having me. Hello, everyone. It's my honor to have such an opportunity to speak about finance and invest in offshore wind projects in Japan. I hope I can deliver some new insights to the audience based on my recent businesses of lending and investing in renewable energy projects as a financial investor. Before starting my speech, let me make a quick introduction to DBJ's business in renewables market in domestic and overseas. DBJ is founded in 1950 by government to recover Japanese economy from the damage caused by World War II. Ever since, DBJ have supported industries mainly with long-term finance, especially utility companies, including power companies, are one of our core supporting industries. In fact, more than 20% of our outstanding loan is in utility companies and related projects. Still, 100% stake of DBJ is owned by the Japanese government, but our organization has been changed into usual Japanese corporate entity in 2008. Our business decisions are made by internal board meeting based on commercial rationality, and we pursue sustainable development through supporting our clients. So let me share some data about our projects. So in domestic market, we provided a loan and invest to the wind farms in early days of renewable energy industry in Japan, which flourished with FIT regime. And now we support renewable energy project through providing both loan and investment. And the total amount is about 600 megawatts as per our stakeholder shareholding. And on the other hand, in international business, in overseas countries, we started investment business in offshore wind project in 2013. The first one was investment in offshore wind project in the UK, named Gunfleet Sands. followed by investment and finances in Germany, Netherlands, and Taiwan as well. So today, based on those, my business areas of loan and fund investment in renewable energy projects in domestic and overseas, I'd like to discuss about the topic scaling up, invest and finance in offshore wind projects in Japan from the view of loan providing bank and also institutional investor. Even time for today's keynote speech is limited. I'd like to address several matters that sometimes even Japanese players have not aware yet. But those are definitely key matters to maximize expected equity IRR from an offshore wind project in Japan.
どうぞ。もうそういう返事しました。もう、10日までに混ぜてください。はい。はい、そうですね。はい。もうみゆきさんに話したんですけども。
Can you mute other participants? Thank you. So first, I'd like to discuss about debt raising. First topic is project finance. Most of you know, offshore wind project in Japan is transitioning in terms of revenue source from FYT regime to FYP regime. The offshore wind project in round 2 will earn its revenues based on FYP regime. Considering debt sizing of project finance, whose size is dependent on amount of certain amount of revenue, debt sizing with FYP might be somehow smaller compared to FYT, which is a firmly fixed price. Especially based on these discussions with several energy consultants in the market, offshore wind project is different from solar projects regarding probability of happening gap between the project's energy generation profile and its local energy generating profile. You should be more careful analyze in sensitivity tests on those profiles. That is a key matter about the raising project finance. And as I mentioned, there is a possibility to getting the debt size smaller somehow compared to the project finance based in with FYT regime. But still, there is a way to scaling up your debt sizing. Besides, debt size for projects with FYP might get smaller than project with FYT revenue. How can sponsors and investors in offshore wind projects can keep a certain expected equity IRR? One of the possible tools is the corporate PPA with similar contract features to FYT revenue. But rather than discussing detail of the possible CPPA, I'd like to address another tool, which is financial, since today is my topic is investment finance. So another tool is equity-backed loan called EBL. The information of the EBL transactions are not open to market so much. It is closed more than senior project finance transactions in the project level. Many of onshore wind projects sponsors seem still not to know it well, even it can maximize their expected return by scaling up the loan in the project in total. But when it comes to consider scaling up the debt raising for offshore wind project, it would be worth to consider to use it. In Japan, a few banks, including DBJ, has been providing EBL for onshore wind projects and also may provide offshore wind projects as well. Once the offshore wind project risk and the sponsor's capability to deal with them has been proven well. Since EBL lenders have to take deeper risk at subordinated position to senior lenders of project finance at project company level. I recommend to involve EBL lenders from the early stage of planning debt raising. That should be a key for successful EBL raising and maximizing debt scale in total jointly with senior project finance. And you can see the chart, and at the top level, you can see the blue box and that name the EBL lender. And the other go down to the holder group. And usually, many relevant parties of the project can see is just the holder group level. You cannot look through over that holder group, how the holder group leverage, raising a leverage debt for that holder group loan. So that's why I mentioned earlier. The information the holder group using the EBL is not so open to market. But again, now you can see this structure shows this project core are already raising the project finance at the project level. In addition to that, your whole sponsor are raising the EBL debt at the holdco level. Therefore, virtually, you earn a much higher DE ratio. That means you can increase your expected IRR. That's the structure of the basic structure of EBL. And this is about the scaling up of the debt finance for offshore wind project in Japan. And the next topic is raising equity capital for the offshore wind project in Japan. First, I'd like to mention about how can you raise the equity capital. One perspective of finance is raising equity capital from the Japanese institutional investors. A typical structure to raise capital from them is establish a fund for invest in offshore wind assets you develop and own. Why does it matter? Because if you are planning to develop offshore wind project and want to increase your expected IRR, raising capital from investors enable you to leverage your IRR. How can that work through? If you raise equity capital from investors at construction phase or operational phase, you can get repayment of cost paid at the development phase earlier than the case you hold all of its stake for a long term. In fact, if you look at the offshore wind market in European countries, one of the major sources of the IRR increase is selling stake of the project at construction or operational phase. In my experiences, selling 50% or less of the stake are seen in many projects in other countries. Once the construction risk or operational risk has been accepted by institutional investors, major buyers of such project stake are institutional investors, including pension fund. From the view of the institutional investor, they are seeking investment opportunity with a certain amount of money, especially if it is a pension fund, more than 100 million US dollar or more will be invested in single project. Regardless countries, of course, including Japan, the institutional investors are quite interested in investing in offshore wind project, which is large and green asset, generating stable cash flow in the long-term basis. When I support supported raising capital by founding an investment fund for renewable energy projects in Japan in recent years. Subscription from investors were about double of what we wanted to raise. Japanese deep pocket of financial market is still existing. I think so. However, I'd like to say here that there are several points to consider raise capital for offshore wind project in Japan. First, you cannot sell the stake of offshore wind project in general sea until operational phase. Second, offshore wind projects are not eligible to raise capital from institutional investors yet, because construction risk is not accepted by the institutional investors yet. The main reason is there is no project in the offshore wind or in the general sea in Japan yet. Just one single offshore wind project became operational in Akita, which was built at coastal nearshore area. That is a big step, but still not enough considering large projects in general sea. So that's sharing my perspective from the view of the institutional investors. Even though there are still challenges to raise capital from the investors in Japan yet, it is key matter to get prepared to do it, because as I mentioned today, it is key factor to increase expected IRR in offshore wind project in Japan, where nowadays many players putting enormous efforts of cost reduction and maximizing expected IRR fiercely. Now, Japanese offshore wind market is facing difficulty to find the way to realize the certain IRR after a result of first tender process in Japan and recent global information. It is difficult to make something new happen at early stage in any market, regardless countries or regions. However, the truth is early movers enjoy the benefit of its position in renewables industry historically and now, as well in every region. So I hope today I could deliver some insight for audiences to make step forward to achieve success in offshore wind project in Japan. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much for your clear and detailed presentation. And here we have several questions we want to ask you. And the first one is, how do you see the challenges or different issues in Japan wind power project development compared with those in European regions?
That's a really good question. Comparing the other markets, it's really helpful to understand the upcoming Japanese market. I think our obvious different point are climate and the conditions of seabed in Japanese general sea. It has typhoon, earthquake, and complicated seabed in some area. However, based on my experience in lending to offshore wind project in coast area in last year and this year, I believe Japanese companies and foreign companies in Japan can overcome those difficulties. I can say developers in Japan can leverage experiences and knowledges from other countries, like European countries, and other asset class. I mean, you can utilize your experiences in onshore wind project or oil and gas project in offshore as well. So I think this is a big advantage point to consider the Japanese players in offshore wind projects. That's my answer.
Thank you. And here is a question from our audience. What's the expected PIRR and EIRR in the round 2?
Oh, that's a really tough question. So, sorry, I cannot give an exact number about the expected IRR for upcoming offshore wind project in round 2. But I'd like to say in range, expected IRR for onshore wind project in Japan, just in range, it is often set from later 5% to before 7%. And thinking about those expected IRR, offshore wind project in General Sea in round 2 should be higher than those ranges. That's what I can provide today.
Yeah, we understand. Thank you. Thank you for your answering. And once again, we want to thank for your presentation. Let us better understand the wind power investment and finance. Thank you. And next, please invite Masahiro Tanabe-san, Counsel and White&Case, to present the keynote inside Japan's second round of offshore wind tender and the criteria assessments. Tanabe-san.
Okay, thank you, Kyla. Hello. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Masa Tanabe. I'm counsel in the Tokyo office of White&Case. My practice focuses on renewable energy, such as offshore wind, and electricity power markets, such as corporate PPAs. And I am happy to have recently joined the Tokyo office of White&Case, as they have extensive experience in offshore wind in various jurisdictions within the region. So let me share my screen. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. Okay, hope you can see my screen now.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. I am very happy to be back here speaking at this webinar organized by Leader Associates. Actually, about 1 year ago, I was here talking about offshore wind. At the time, it was about the round 1 results. At the time, everybody was shocked, obviously, with the round 1 results. So
sorry, Tanabe-san, your screen is not full. You add the editor model, I think.
Oh, okay. Hold on a second. Is it editor mode? Okay, excuse me.
Tanabe-san, actually, we have your slides. Maybe we can switch the slides for you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, please wait a moment.
Yep. Okay, I'll just continue speaking. Yes, so it was 1 year ago. I was talking about the round 1 results, which was shocking. This year, it's a privilege. I will be talking about the developments that have been made since then, in particular, the round 2 auctions, the rules, and the point system. Okay, round 2, we talk about round 2. What is round 2? just to be clear, it is the 4 sites that are shown in the map here, namely Happonoshiro, Oga Katagami, Akita, Murakami Tainai, and Saikai, and totaling the output, totaling at approximately 1.8 gigawatt. I wanted to, make it clear up front, because there's maybe some confusion on what we call round 2. And because last year, when we were talking in last year's session, round 2 was considered as just the Happonoshiro project. Because at the time, Happonoshiro was going to be the only round 2 project. But this year, it is now combined with the other 3 projects. So all 4 sites will be called round 2. So in this presentation, we'll consider these 4 sites, 4 promotion zones as round 2. Next slide. So this session is about updating everyone on the Japanese auction, offshore wind auctions. What happened after the round 1 results coming out in December 2021? Well, obviously everyone was shocked. There was a lot of controversy, a lot of discussions in the industry. There was dialogue between the Japanese government and the industry. There's dialogue between the Japanese government and various politicians. A lot of discussion going on soon after the round 1 results came out. Then in March, the Japanese government announced the suspension of Happonoshiro. So that was suspended. Now it has joined the new round 2 auctions that is happening now. And then there's further discussion in the Japanese government. Meanwhile, in September 2022, the 3 round 2 promotion zones were designated. And in November, the draft auction guidelines came out. And then it went through a public comment process. And then in December 2022, the official auction guidelines came out. And that's when the round 2 auction actually started. It is now open to a submission of bids. And as we speak, the auction is ongoing. The window for submission of bids would close in June 2023. And hopefully the round 2 results will come out in the later part of this year. So that's kind of the timeline of the offshore wind auctions from round 1 results to throughout round 2 results. So next slide. Yes, so we are here at round 2. So what are the new changes to the auction rules? What are the difference as compared to the round 1 auction rules? There are various changes and differences, and you may have read it in various articles. But basically, I see these 4 key differences between round 1 and round 2. Key difference number 1 is the ceiling price. Round 1, the ceiling price was 29 Japanese yen. But the bid price was much lower than 29 yen. It was, the winning bid was 12 yen, 13 yen, and 16 yen, respectively. So it turned out to be much lower than the ceiling price set for round 1. So in round 2, the ceiling price was set at 19 Japanese yen for the 3 projects, excluding the Saikai project. For the Saikai project, it was set at 29 yen due to the difference in the geological conditions. So that's difference number one. Difference number two is the change. Not yet. Yes, feed-in tariff to feed-in premium. This was a big change. It will obviously affect the bidding strategies of each bidder. Round one, everyone was bidding at and feed-in tariff, but now from round two, it would be feed-in premium. This feed-in premium means that basically it is a contract for difference. And what that means is that the bidders will need to find a place to actually sell its generated electricity, either to the market or to a specific off-taker. So this will come into the bidding strategy under the feed-in premium regime. The third difference is the limitation on how many sites you can win. Obviously, in round one, there was no limitation. So Mitsubishi Corporation Consortium was able to win all 3 sites. A lot of controversy on that point. So in round two, there was a limitation on how much you can win. And basically, it was set at 1 gigawatt. Once you reach 1 gigawatt worth of projects, then you cannot win further projects. The fourth difference is the point system. The basic structure hasn't changed, but there are various key changes in the point system. So I will explain a little bit more in the next slide. Yes, thank you. This is a simplified table of the point system. So what has changed in the point system since round one? Well, the basic structure hasn't changed. Isshu has, Kikuma-san has covered this a little bit in his presentation. The point system basically hasn't changed since the round one. It still has the price component. It has the feasibility component, 120 points for the price component and 120 points for the feasibility component. So that basic structure has not changed. Also, for the price component, the winning bidder will take all of the 120 points. You get the full 120 points if you have the lowest bidding price. So that basic structure has not changed since round one. But there are some differences that I would like to highlight. So I have three changes. Key change number one is, Kikuma-san also mentioned this in his presentation. It's the, I call them the speed points. Speed points. In other words, early operation points. This means that if you can reach commercial operation on an earlier date, then you get more points than your competitors who may have a later commercial operation date. So for example, in the Happo Noshiro auction, if your commercial operation date is on or before June of 2027, then you get the full 20 points. But if your commercial operation date is after that date, then you get a little lower point of like 12 points. If you're later than that, then you have 8 points, and so on and so on. So the earlier your commercial operation date is, you have more points on these speed points or early operation points. The second change I'd like to highlight is the stable power supply points. This was also mentioned in Kikuma-san's presentation. And he also mentioned it's basically a supply chain. You establish a good supply chain, then you get more points. In round one, it was only about 10 points, but now in round two, they increased it to 20 points. So if you have a supply chain, a good local supply chain, you are eligible to get 20 points. The third key difference is how you get the feasibility points. In round two, the top runner will have the full 120 points on the feasibility component. In round one, it was not that way. You just stack up the points, and even if you're the top runner, you just get whatever points you have been able to stack up. In round one, it would have been even the bid winner. They only had like 80, 90 points on the feasibility component. But now in round two, if you are the top runner, then you get the full 120 points, which is the same as the price component, full point price component, 120 points, 120 points. So this will be a key difference as compared to round one. But still, even with these changes, even with these improvements, there are still issues with round two point system. Issue number one is that still the point allocation does not seem to be exactly appropriate or perfectly appropriate. Still, the Japanese point system, it's 120 for price, 120 for feasibility, which means that the price component would probably be the decisive factor in winning the bid. The track record of the bidding consortium is considered, but it still makes up only a small portion of the feasibility points. So this kind of point allocation, it may not be perfectly appropriate for the Japanese systems, but still it is in place. The second big issue is that the point system is getting more complicated in round two. There's adjustment systems, adjustment points that would be made, for example, to the speed points. So it's got a little more complicated than the round one auctions. And also, it is unclear how these point allocation will actually work in practice. In round one, the disclosure of information was not sufficient. So not many people know what actually happened in the how the points were actually allocated in the round one auctions. So it's not clear how that will be allocated in the round two auctions as well. So those are the big issues that we still see in the round two points system. So with all of that, I hope I have been able to set the stage for the next upcoming panel discussion on these offshore wind auctions. The panel consists of industry leaders. So the discussion should be very, very informative. I'm looking forward to that. If anyone has questions on the presentation, please feel free to reach out separately. I'd be happy to further discuss any of these points. So thank you for your attention. Back to you, Kyla.
Thank you, Tanabe-san. Thank you for your wonderful speech. And also, we have two questions, one question from my side and another question from our audience. The first one is, how can Japan expand its offshore wind projects in exclusive economic zones? And what kind of support can government, including METI, ANRA, can provide?
Exclusive economic zone, that is a hot topic in Japan. And that will be a substantial, that would be a substantial issue for the offshore wind industry. I understand the industry will work with the Japanese government. The Japanese government is trying to put in place a legislation to make that happen. It will be a big news for the industry. So I'm really following that discussion within the Japanese government.
Okay, and here's the second question from Mr. Zheng Hao. By the sound of it, the earliest date for COD was defined in order to get to the fourth core. Is this correctly understood, or what if a developer can commit to an even early COD date?
The COD date, there are the auction guidelines have actual COD dates, specific COD dates in the guidelines. You'll have to look at them. It depends on the project site. Each project site will have different target COD dates. So look into the auction guidelines, and you'll see the specific COD dates. Sorry, I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation and your answering. Thank you. And then comes to our next keynote, powering net zero with floating wind, the global and the Japan prospects, and will be presented by Mr. William Cleverly, CEO from OWC. Hi, Mr. William.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me with you today. Let me just share my screen. Okay, my topic today is on floating wind and on the global and Japanese prospects. And the question that was posed to me when I was drafting this presentation is how it links to net zero emissions. So let's start there. This chart you see on the right-hand side is from GWEC back in 2020, and it shows the huge increase in renewable energy that's needed from today to hit 2,000 gigawatts, which is what GWEC thinks is required to close the net zero emissions gap. So there's a big difference between where we are today and where we need to be in 2050. But keep that number 2,000 gigawatts in your mind, because I think a lot of this can be closed with floating wind. So I'll spend a bit of time today talking about the floating wind opportunity globally and the risks globally, and then do a deep dive into floating wind in Japan. But firstly, who are we? Why are we talking about floating wind? So OWC is a consultancy that's worked in the floating wind sector for many years. We've worked on over 13 gigawatts of floating capacity around the world. And in particular in Japan, we spent the last year working on many development, design, fabrication, and market studies. So we like to think we understand it relatively well, and we're extremely excited about the sector. I'm calling you today from a foggy, blurry-eyed England, but we have offices all around the world, including in Tokyo. So I suggest you do reach out to some of my colleagues in Tokyo for further information on floating wind. So the very basics, I'm not sure it's been discussed in a lot of detail today, but I can see there's some very experienced and senior people on the line, so I won't go into the basics too much. Essentially, a floating wind farm is similar to a fixed wind farm, apart from it's not connected by a solid structure to the seabed. It's more tethered, like a vessel would be. And this allows the wind farms to be in much deeper water. And indeed, wind turbines, like floating structures, they perform better and produce higher energy yield when on a more flexible floating structure than on a fixed one. And so why floating wind? Why do we think this is a particular technology that will help close the gap to net zero? Well, there's a huge demand for clean energy, particularly in today's world with the backdrop of the war, and we've seen how quickly fixed offshore wind can fill the gap in renewables. Floating offshore wind opens up even greater areas of the ocean that could provide these secure and clean energy resources. On the table on the right-hand side here, you can see the floating wind potential around the world. You can see that just Japan has 500 gigawatts of floating wind potential. And this was estimated back in 2012. Various consultancies and companies have upgraded that potential number since, and I'll go on to talk about that later, but it could be double or triple that number. Which you'll remember is not far away from the 2,000 gigawatts that we need to close this net zero gap. And the reason is that floating wind opens up vast areas of ocean, and there's hope that the cost of floating wind will come down in a similar way to the way that for oil and gas, the cost of floating wind, the cost of floating oil and gas structures actually came out at a lower number than the fixed ones. And the huge decrease in cost of offshore wind we've seen in the last 20 years. So what's been done to date? Not a huge amount compared to fixed wind. There's 123 megawatts installed around the world, mainly single demonstrators. The largest is Kincardine, which is only 50 megawatts in size. There will be another floating wind farm twice the size installed off the UK in 2026, which is Erebus, a project that OWC are working on. But it's still relatively small pre-commercial projects that are hitting the water at this moment. And in fact, the majority of these are in Japan. There's 3 floating offshore wind demonstrator projects with a variety of substructures, 2 semi-sub, 2 spar, and 1 barge, developed by Mitsui, MHI, and JMU, big shipbuilding companies, as well as Toda and Hitachi. And since then, another 6, again in Japan, are going through R&D stages, again a spread of semi-subspar and TLP. So in total, 11 different floater options are going through demo and R&D phase in Japan, making Japan very much the world leader in R&D for floating wind tech. So the question is really how Japan takes this advantage, this first leader position, and ramps up to commercial scale projects in floating wind. So let's look at the timeline to take off. Floating wind started being developed in the early 2000s. The first project was installed in 2007, another one off Portugal in 2011, one in Scotland in 2017. And in that time, a number of early demonstrator and R&D projects, particularly in Japan, as I said, have been developed. In this decade, we expect the first commercial tenders to come out in France, in the Celtic Sea, in Scotland, in the US, with projects starting to be built towards the end of this decade. And we think a big boom from 2030 onwards, with 10 gigawatts or more being developed. And indeed, that forecast is matched by GWEC. Here we see over 100% year-on-year growth for the next 5 years, and then 60% year-on-year growth for the years after that. A hugely exciting and massive growth opportunity for the world in this clean energy technology. And you can see towards the end of the 2020s, the light green color coming in, which is Japan, and really contributing to the growth in floating wind. So if you were to add all those projects up, the cumulative installed capacity hit 16 gigawatts by 2030, which was an impressively exponential graph until, bam, ScotWind came along and approved another 15 gigawatts of floating wind, which I think was a surprise to many in the industry, but a fantastic show of ambition and pipeline. So that chart would look even more exponential now with Scotland added on top. So a huge, exciting opportunity, but not one without risks. So let me just talk through a few risks, and I'm going to focus on the supply chain risks, just leading on from the previous presentation on how supply chain can be linked into the auction. There are, of course, other risks with floating wind that come with the opportunities, more on the technical side, dynamic cabling, O&M, floater options. So let's start with fabrication. In Scotland alone, to achieve that 15 gigawatts over 5 years, needs one 15 megawatt foundation to be built every 2 days. Every 2 days for 5 years. Something as large as what you see on the right-hand side here needs to be constructed. The floating technology there is Saito, which is a company based in Bilbao. So this is the Saito technology inside the Bilbao Stadium, just to give an idea of size. One of these football pitch-sized constructions every 2 days for 5 years needs to be achieved for ScotWind, and that's only one of the many countries looking at floating offshore wind. So it's a huge challenge, but one that has mitigations in certain technologies, and one that provides a great opportunity to the supply chain. Moving on to ports, we get asked a lot as OWC to look at various ports around a development and to advise which one's ready for floating wind. And unfortunately, the answer is usually none of them. There's a huge amount of upgrades that are needed for ports to be ready for floating wind, to have the right quayside length, to have the right bearing capacity, to have the huge laydown and wet storage areas that are needed, and the massive cranes available and on site. So there's a lot of upgrade, there's a lot of investment that's needed in ports around the world for floating wind, which is partly mitigated in Japan and elsewhere by investment. The Japanese government have designated various base ports around Japan to meet future demands, 4 already designated and another 11 added in September 2022. So it's happening. Ports are being upgraded. The additional complexity in Japan is that the large shipyards are concentrated on the west, whereas the massive floating offshore wind potential is generally in the east. And so on the topic of Japan, let's do a bit of a deep dive into the country itself and the opportunities there. So on this slide, you can see 2 different companies looking at the offshore wind potential of Japan. GWEC estimated it at about 1,700 gigawatts floating wind potential. MOE estimated it as 783 gigawatts, both massive numbers, both much greater than the 500 initially estimated, and both very significant when it comes to net zero ambitions globally. The difference between the numbers comes from the variables that were put into the analysis. MOE assumed that floating wind farm will be constructed within the 12 nautical mile limit, and GWEC assumed that they could be built outside further into the EEZ, a question that I'm sure will come up later in the panel discussion today. So it shows that a further 1,000 gigawatts, a terawatt of floating wind energy is available if developers are allowed to develop floating wind beyond the 12 nautical mile limit. Let's look at the developability of floating wind off Japan. The three charts you see on the three maps you see on the bottom here, I think the most obvious thing is there's not a huge difference between the three maps. They look pretty similar. And the variable that we've changed here is the water depth. So what we're showing is there's not a huge change between the available floating wind area at 200 meters, at 500 meters, and at 1,000 meters, which means most of the floating wind opportunity in Japan is between 60 and 200 meters, very much developable compared to other floating wind countries around the world. But what happens if we go beyond 12 nautical miles? If we assume that the Japanese government will release sites eventually beyond this limit. On the left-hand side here, you can see if we extend from 12 nautical miles to 100 kilometers, there's a large floating wind area off the west coast, which is near these ports and harbors that I mentioned previously, would become available. And indeed, if deeper waters are used, then there's many more floating wind sites around the world. If this 12 nautical mile limit is lifted, there's, as GWEC shows, 1,000 gigawatts more potential around Japan. So it's a really important discussion that's happening at the moment within the Japanese government, and one that we're watching very, very carefully. Because with areas further from shore comes higher wind speed. So if these areas could be released whilst they may be in slightly deeper water, the wind yield is significantly higher, up to 9 meters per second in some areas, which would drastically reduce the levelized cost of energy for floating wind in Japan, which is ultimately what we all want. There's not a huge amount in the pipeline for floating wind in Japan at the moment, and this is a big shame, given the first leader advantage, given the fantastic R&D and development funding and achievements in Japan, to only have 2 floating wind sites in the various stages of development is I think a bit of a shame. So this is only Goto City, which is small, 17 megawatts, and Kuji City, which you can see is in the preparatory stage, that are floating wind. If we compare that to other countries, in the UK, where I'm sitting now, I talked about ScotWind, which was 15 gigawatts. There's also Intog, which again is in Scotland, and the Celtic Sea, where we're closely working with developers, which is another 4 gigawatts. So a clear pipeline of floating wind opportunities. There's the same in the US, in Korea, in China. And that is somewhat lacking in Japan. There's no specific floating target set. And as I say, there's only one project, the Kuji project, that's to be tendered in 2025 and will be installed after 2030. So we do think that the Japanese government needs to set an ambitious floating offshore wind specific target to develop this pipeline of work to accelerate the supply chain for this industry. So to conclude, the floating wind opportunity is huge. I do think it can help close the net zero gap globally. But to do that, we need a supply chain around the world. We need one in Japan, and the supply chain needs the confidence to invest. And so we're keeping a very close eye on the lifting of this 12 nautical mile limit. That would drastically increase the amount of floating wind from 700 to 1700 gigawatts. There's currently only one floating offshore wind farm project in Japan, and so the recommendation is that the government set an ambitious floating offshore wind specific target to promote the supply chain and to bring floating wind home. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Thank you for your memorable and wonderful speech. It's very informative for us, I think. Yeah, here are two questions from my side. The first one is, US and Scotland is currently the top leader in terms of floating development. So what have they done right so far, and could their success be replicated in Japan?
So Scotland and the US have actually tackled it in very different ways. So Scotland is encouraging much more investment into the supply chain, whereas the way the US auction is governed, it's more about an uncapped auction providing a lot of money at the beginning to the state government. So the auctions are difficult to compare, and the floating wind opportunities and technologies are very different as well. Off California, the water depth is approaching 1,000 meters. In Scotland, it's much closer to the Japanese depths of sort of 200 meters or so. I guess what could be learnt though in both those scenarios is the ambition shown by the various governments and the clear indication to the supply chain that there will be this pipeline, and in doing so with these big numbers, big news, it allows ports to be developed, supply chains to be built, and it's a virtuous cycle that if you're the country that has these big ambitions and has built the supply chain, you become the country that becomes the hub for floating wind for that particular area. So we expect that in California, we expect that in Scotland, and we hope for that in Japan.
Yeah, we understand. And the second question for you is, what's your top suggestion for your counterparts who are committed to promoting floating wind application in Japan?
I think to watch this space. From looking at government announcements, the two things that clearly need to happen, I think, are allowing floating wind development in the EEZ, announcement we're expecting this year. If that's allowed, then there's a whole host of new areas around Japan that could become fantastic sites with low levelized cost of energy and high energy yield. It will be a step change when that happens. So I recommend that the developers and stakeholders keep an eye out for that.
Thank you. And here is a question from our audience, Mr. Frank. What do you think as a major technical risk for larger than 500 meters water depths?
Probably the biggest technical risk is the dynamic cables. We haven't seen floating wind in those water depths before, and we've seen from fixed wind that cables tend to have the largest amount of issues and claims when compared to other elements of an offshore wind farm. So take that current risk and then multiply it by many hundreds of meters and add in the dynamic factor, and it'll be a technical risk. It's one that's being looked at and has been looked at for many decades. This isn't new news. but I'd say that was my top one.
Thank you, and I sincerely appreciate it for your answering. And then now I'm glad to have our expert find panel activating Japan's offshore wind industry, the key determinants and the successful factors. Please welcome our moderator, Mr. Palau, Senior Business Development Manager from OW Ocean Winds, and our panel colleagues. Welcome. Mr. Palau.
Oh, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I would appreciate if my colleagues can also turn on their cameras. I think that would be.
Let me see. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah,
Oh, we can
no
hear your voice.
We have 4 panelists today, and waiting for them to turn on the camera. I cannot see them at this stage.
Yeah, we have 4 panelists and they all here.
Okay, wonderful. So the panel will have basically 3 parts, very simple parts. One will be introduction from all of us. Then we will discuss different topics, and we will try to have at least 5-10 minutes at the very end to Q&A. So without further ado, I will give the floor to each panelist to introduce themselves. I will do so at the very end. So first of all, Nakayama-san.
Yes. All right. So before I start, let me express my sincere appreciation to the organizers and people who contributed to make this event happen, as well as audience. Thank you. I'm Chikako Nakayama, a country manager of Iberdrola Renewables Japan. Very nice to meet you. Let me start with who we are. Iberdrola is a Spanish company, and we are one of the biggest electricity and utility company on this planet. All right, and we have been leading the wind power industry in all over the world. And now we are about to develop the 5 gigawatt floating wind application in UK. So we are the biggest, but we never stop. Let me talk about Iberdrola Renewables Japan. The company carefully chosen Japan as a strategic base for Asia Pacific. We landed here in 2020 December, and so we are just 2 years old. We are still small, but we are having big dream. And let me briefly talk about myself. I started my career as a process engineer and developed myself to a project manager of the multi-billion-dollar international energy project in the oil and gas industry. So the first 10 years, I was in the very heavy oil business. And last 2 decades, there was gas shift. So I shifted myself to the gas business, natural gas and LNG. And now we are shifting to the renewable energy society. So I shifted myself to the renewables. So this is who I am. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nakayama-san. So let's move now to Roland, if it's possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. It's been very interesting to hear some of the keynote speakers speak about the market, both the fixed and floating offshore wind farms. I'll provide a short introduction, and I'm not too sure, but I'd like to just share my screen as I do that, just to give everybody a bit of a reference point here. I'm just going to share our website because it offers you an opportunity to go and find a little bit more information about green power investors. As introduced, my name is Roland Thompson. I'm an executive officer at Green Power Investments here in Japan. Green Power Investments is a renewable energy company, and our mission is to create clean and sustainable energy solutions for the community and business here in Japan. You can see some relevant photographs that we're sharing here on our website. And as we help to transition the industry and create renewable energy here in Japan, we look to create a positive impact to communities across the archipelago of Japan. It's been exciting. You can see a few pictures there of the Tsugaru project up in Tohoku, which has been one of our recent successes, 122 megawatt onshore project. Green Power was founded in 2004, and Tomohiro Hori-san was the founding officer. Our equity is supported by our US head office, which is Patent Energy in the US. Currently, Green Power Investments has operating in Japan a relatively small fleet. We have 224 megawatts operating across 5 sites at the moment. We have under construction 305 megawatts, which includes the Ishikari Offshore project, which is 114 megawatts currently. We also have a pipeline of both onshore and offshore wind that total close to about 3.5 gigawatts in total here in Japan. Thank you. That's my short introduction. And if you do want to find some more information, just click our website, and there are plenty of short videos there which will provide you some information about some of our sites and some of our operations across Japan.
Thank you very much, Roland. And next we have Hiroshi-san.
Yep, I'm Hiroshi, Associate General Manager of Sumitomo Trust Bank, Sumi Trust, SMTB. I'm dealing with project finance for both Japanese domestic projects and international projects, and the main area in Japan is renewables, in particular wind, of both offshore and onshore and solar. Regarding offshore wind power projects, we SMTB have already participated in 17 projects in Europe, and recently participated in the first offshore wind power projects in the United States, Vineyard project. In Japan, SMTB has so far participated in 2 port area offshore wind power projects till last year, Akita Noshiro Port, which achieved the COD recently, and Ishikari, which Roland just introduced. And we'll participate in another one this year. Regarding round 2 of the Japan's offshore wind power projects tender process, which began at the end of the last year, consultation between the consortia preparing bidding and lenders has already started since last year, and we are proactively responding to the consultation process. Thank you.
Thank you for the brevity. Thank you so much, Yoshi-san. And last, we have also Saito-san. I think the audience already know you from the previous presentation, but thank you.
Yeah, I hope the audience is still focusing on my self-quick introduction. So I'm Tomohiro Saito. I've worked for more than 15 years at the Development Bank of Japan, and mainly engaged in invest and M&As. At the last more than 5 years, I'm focusing on invest and finance in renewable energy projects in domestic and overseas as well. And DBJ is owned by 100% by Japanese government, and pursuing their clients' achievements. Recently, especially the going green is one of the big topic. And regarding the renewable energy business, we've started our investment in offshore wind project in 2013. It was an offshore wind project in the UK, the name Ganfleet Sands. And still we hold that project, and actually I'm a non-executive officer of that related company of that project. And for that project, DBJ continued to invest in offshore wind project in Germany, and also finance in Netherlands, and also invested in the Taiwan offshore wind project as well. So, on the other hand, in the domestic project, just around the starting FIT regime started in Japan, we've started providing finance for onshore wind project and the solar power project in Japan. And recently, not only providing finance, project finance, but also invest directly in a solar project and also indirectly invest onshore wind projects. One of the big investment was supporting raising fund by the Green Power Investment Law and Beyond. And it was a fantastic project. The fund amount was one of the biggest size, 530 million. So I think such a investment experience and also providing the finance experience could be something insightful for today's audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think we are running a little bit late on time, so I will try to give my introduction very briefly and to the point. I represent OWC here in Japan. If you are not familiar with OWC, it's a pity. I hope you learn a little bit about us. We have the logo there with our name is Ocean Winds, also known as OWC. What we basically do is develop, build, and operate offshore wind farms. The only thing we do is offshore wind. And we are the creation. We are going to be exactly 3 years very, very soon. Joint venture created by ENGIE and EDP Renewables. This year and last year, we are growing at a special fast pace. We reached 16 gigawatts. The biggest offshore wind farm in Scotland, Moray East, is part of the portfolio. And then we also believe pioneers in floating. That's why we're very interested also on looking and hearing from you what do you think on Japan, right? We have, and to be honest, also we appreciate also Will and Cleverly on the previous presentation, having this background to show we flow Atlantic, but I think the start of the presentation, the end, all the photos that you show of floating, most of them were about wind flow Atlantic. So leaving that aside and trying to move on the panel itself, let's talk a little bit of what do you think about Japan? What do you think about offshore? The business started 3-4 years ago, and now is moving at a different pace. We have the first round. This December start the second round. A difficult market, some of the people in Europe looking at it say, but many things that I think we can discuss today. And I would like to start, first of all, with Nakayama-san, and from a very big company, as you mentioned at your introduction, as Iberdrola, how do you look at Japan and what will be the strategy for Japan? I think you are on mute, Nakayama-san. So maybe you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry about that. All right, thank you for asking our strategy. And let me start with vision and then how we view the Japanese opportunities. As you understand, government announced the 10 gigawatt by 2030, and then between like 30 gigawatt and 45 gigawatt by 2040 or 2050. So this is a huge opportunity for us associated with the floating application. So this is our view, that huge opportunities. And starting with our vision, we are fully aligned with the Japanese government's vision, and we will be part of that. So that if we share the same vision as the Japanese government, we will be part of that. Right. So how we achieve, that is our strategy. We will achieve our vision by the strategic partnership. We partner up with well-established Japanese energy company, and this is our strategy. And the other strategy we have is we will be in line with green growth strategy issued by METI. So these two are the key strategy we have to achieve our target by 2030 or 2040 and more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. During the previous presentation that we saw, particularly Tanabe-san and Kikuma-san explained what are the different situations in which we can see the Japanese market. I would like to also talk to the other developer here today, which is Roland, and find what are some of the key challenges that you have faced during development offshore wind in Japan.
Thank you for the question. Perhaps we don't have enough time to go through all of them, but I'd just like to say, that as Iwao-san and Saito-san kindly mentioned, that we have been successful in achieving financial close for our offshore wind farm project up in Ishikari. And I think as the industry evolves in Japan, for any developer here in the market, that is obviously a very positive sign that there is very good support from the Japanese lenders. Iwao-san and Saito-san did some wonderful work to help us through that financial close process. But there are significant challenges in dealing with getting to that point. As you can imagine, it's an evolving industry. You have high costs. There are a lot of technical barriers. There is limited experience across the market, both in terms of contractors and counterparties, but also the individual skills of the employees you want to deploy at the sites. You've also got environmental and regulatory constraints. And basically, as we've been highlighting on some of the previous discussions, currently a lack of infrastructure, particularly at the port level, and even for some of the interconnections for some of these large offshore sites. So with all those, there are, as a developer, a minefield, so to speak, of how do you strategically align your risk profile. As Chikako kindly mentioned, you have to have good partners, both in terms of how you're developing the project, but also on the ground with local contributors from the community, and be very actively engaged and communicate actively with people across the industry. I can talk to specifics, but perhaps one particular area which, when we were in the early stages of Ishikari's development, was the vessel logistics. It was very challenging. The Japanese cabotage sort of restrictions for vessels in Japan created a fairly long assessment process, and a very costly one at that, on what we could do to try and select the best turbine for our AEP targets, but also be able to build the site with a vessel that is flagged here in Japan. Eventually, we worked with our partner Shimizu, and they went out and built a vessel that could lift the 8 megawatt Siemens turbine that we're actually deploying at the site. But that challenge, I think, over time will become less of a concern, but there's still going to be a significant shortage of vessels for the industry, and that is something that I think all developers will have to clearly identify as being something to manage very quickly.
Right.
I'll pause there and maybe allow questions to come up a little bit later. I think there are some interesting technical challenges, as well as the environmental challenges, but I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll give it back to the moderator.
Thank you so much, Roland. I think the cabotage issue is a relevant issue that has been brought up by also some of the trading houses that already have projects or won in the round for first round. It's a complicated issue, and thank you for your insights. I like also the expression of being a minefield to develop in Japan. So I would like to see if Chikako Nakayama-san, you have seen the same challenges, or there's one particular challenge that you would like to?
Yes, the challenge, I think, or we think, is already presented by Ronald. And the biggest challenge, I believe, is the port availability. As you understand, as we all understand, Tohoku area is one of the popular destinations for the offshore wind developer. But as you can understand, we only have two base ports designated by the government, only two. We have so many projects in Tohoku area and only two base ports. This is significantly challenged, as you understand. And the second challenge is, of course, the vessel, installation vessel. The cabotage law is issue. Cabotage law is really issue. So let me get into the point. We need a more installation vessel. And then the, especially for the heavy foundation installation. So if we don't have it in Japan, we have to bring up from outside. So these are the two major challenges in the Japanese market. Let me get it back to you.
Thank you very much, Nakayama-san. I don't know if either you or Roland wants to mention a little bit how you manage this challenge to create success. Roland, do you want to, or shall we, or do you think this is answered with the previous explanation on the cabotage?
No, I agree with Chikako. I think that port availability is very limiting, and so are the vessels. But no, I completely agree. Thank you. We can move on.
Thank you very much. And so I think we have been keeping 2 of our panelists waiting for a long time. But let's move to the finance side of things, which is nonetheless one of the most important things in offshore wind. Really, we were talking about this intensive capital business as offshore wind. So how are the institutional and lenders, also institutional investors and lenders, interested in investing in Japan in offshore wind business? How do you think? How do you see that? Shall we start maybe with Saito-san?
Yes, sure. So first of all, I'd like to say, I'd like to make comment from the view of the investors, or maybe as a lender, you also will comment. And from the view of the investor, yes, so many institutional investors are interested in invest in offshore wind project in Japan, because they prefer to invest in stable cash flow asset and also green, and that is a perfect combination. But and also the investment amount is huge. Once you could raise the capital from the institutional investors, more than hundreds of million Japanese yen will be raised for a single project. So that would be a really important matter to make offshore wind projects successful in terms of the expected IRR. And also, I'd like to quickly mention that is the main source of the IRR increase in European countries' projects. That's my comment about this matter.
From the lender's point of view, Hiroshi-san, do you have any comment also about the attractiveness of the Japanese market?
Yeah, sorry about that. So Japanese financial institutions' interest in offshore wind is very high, and the appetite is very strong. It's in response to growing interest in SDGs and decarbonization. Renewable energy has become the most heavily weighted loan target in the Japanese project finance market. And not only mega banks, but also regional banks, institutional investors such as insurance companies are actively lending for renewables. However, recently the number of the solar projects, which had been the major targets until now, has decreased due to the lack of suitable large-scale land. Financial institutions that are active in renewables are starving for financing opportunities. And also, there are no concerns about the amount of funds for lending. The amount that can be used for lending is very large. On the other hand, it takes a long time to finance across each project, in particular large-size projects such as offshore winds. And considering the current speed of tender process for offshore wind in general waters, it is so slow that we don't have to worry about the volume of necessary funds. For example, the financial close for round 2 project is at least about 2 years away in the future. And also international private banks also seem to be interested in Japan's offshore winds. I think the broader range of participants, the better. Thank you.
That's very insightful, and thank you so much, Hiroshi-san. I would like to make a more concrete question, perhaps, to Saito-san, with your perspective as institutional investor. My question will be, and I think will be interesting for all of us. Offshore wind projects in Japan are eligible enough to raise equity capital or not? That will be the question.
Thank you, Carlos. That's a really good question because my answer is not yet. The reason is in Japanese offshore wind market, in a commercial scale, just one project is operational in Akita Prefecture. It reached COD last year. But that is an offshore wind project located in nearshore area, not the general sea. So thinking about the probability to the expanding the market in general sea offshore wind project, we need to wait for some offshore wind project in general sea project reach the operational. There are two reasons. First, in Japanese law, Japanese offshore wind restriction, that restrict the selling the stake of the offshore wind projects until the operational phase. Just after operational phase, you can sell the stake of the offshore wind project up to 50%. And the second reason is compared to senior lenders, institutional investors are more conservative to taking risk and evaluating that project risk. So thinking about that point, we have to watch the exact project that reach the COD is in successful construction and operation. That's a challenge, and but once several projects reach to that point, and institutional investors get self-confidence about they can take the risk of the construction or operation, maybe that will be a starting point of the next period in the Japanese offshore wind market.
Thank you very much, Saito-san. I think one of the most important in terms of finance and revenue stream that we have seen this year is the change of the Japanese government from an FIT system to an FIP. And I think that was explained quite detailed by Tanabe-san from White&Case in the previous presentation. In that regard, I would like to pose this question to Hiroshi-san. How do you view the revenue stream for round 2 in Japan offshore wind in this new auction?
Thank you for asking. So in round 2, FIP, a feed-in premium, was introduced for revenue stream. Revenue stream is a very important issue this time. Bidders can count sales revenue in wholesale electricity market JPEX, revenue from FIP, and income from corporate PPAs, other projects revenue stream. But in Japan's project finance market, lenders have not experienced each of them as bankable revenue stream so far in context of non-recourse finance, since lenders relied on FIT feed-in tariff for a long time for renewable energy financing, and FIP and corporate PPA are just beginning. Furthermore, FIP and corporate PPAs are very complicated compared with FIT. Non-fossil certificates values and balancing costs are new items to be considered. Thus, risk factors for consideration increase. Currently, in the Japanese renewable energy market, discussion on bankability regarding FIP and corporate PPA is ongoing not only for offshore winds, but also for solars. We as MTV would like to cope with the challenge in a flexible manner, considering consistency, predictability, transparency, and reasonableness. Thank you.
I think you know particularly well about the Taiwanese market. I think Japan is learning from all the countries, and probably in Asia the most advanced country is Taiwan. So we're really interested very briefly to understand your opinion about the Yulin project, which has facing serious completion delays. And do you think that will affect?
Exactly. Actually, we as MTV is not participating in the other project. Actually, however, we have a concern on that project actually. So recently, Yulin project, offshore wind power project in Taiwan, is facing a serious delay in completion. According to the reports, COD has been delayed for at least 2 years. wind turbines which have been installed are only about 20% of total plant numbers, and one or two monopiles have fallen into the sea during installation. So actually, we are concerned about the impact on Japan's offshore wind development. From this event, actually, since the project is geographically close to Japan, and for example, lenders' view of offshore wind projects may become negative. So we hope that early clarification of the cause and how to prevent similar events, such as making sure due diligence points which should be focused will be carried out, and that the lessons learned will be used in a positive manner to prevent similar situations from happening in other projects. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we have had a deep dive on the financing of the projects and the view from two recognized experts. I think we can just take a step back and look again at the broad picture of Japan as a country where we believe, I think we agree on this panel, can be one of the biggest markets for offshore wind. So looking at that, and perhaps coming back to developers again, particularly Roland, I would like to ask you what developments do you believe are needed to further activate the offshore wind industry in Japan?
Certainly, and it's a very good question. When you asked me that previously, I thought about it, but we do have to look at the industry holistically, and that particularly drives to the question of what the Japanese government is doing here in Japan, but also within the region. Renewable targets are pretty aggressive. They have greenhouse gas emissions to 46% reduction by 2030. They have a 10 gigawatt target for 2030 for offshore wind. But right now, if you look at the Class K certification of wind farms, and actually wind farms that have received their wind farm certification, there's only 280 megawatts that's been certified to date. So it's a very small number. It's 2023. It's going to be a very significant challenge to make it to 10 gigawatts by the end of this decade. So I think if the government could look at Japan as part of this environment where we have Taiwan and Korea, and address the cabotage issue in a holistic way, so vessels could easily move between the different jurisdictions, that would give obviously developers a lot more opportunity and a lot more vessel owners the opportunity to deploy vessels in a very sort of proactive and efficient way. It'd be good if the Japanese government can also look at it holistically in a local level. You see, we deal with the Ministry METI quite a bit, obviously, with all the applications we do. We also have the Minister of Environment, Minister of Land Transportation and Tourism, the fisheries industry, etc. So these industries are very independent and autonomous. So trying to provide a more cohesive interface for developers in the industry would be very, very helpful, I think, as well. So the first point I'd sort of like to encourage for helping stimulate the Japan offshore industry is to look at the authorities both here in Japan, Japanese government level, in sort of looking at the industry holistically across the region and trying to address some of these cabotage issues for developers, but also here at a local level in dealing with the local government agencies. I think another area which maybe are less known about is we do have some very active wind associations in Japan. They are very active in promoting the business interaction with government and local agencies, but I would like to see them more active in the public sector and promoting renewable energy in Japan more actively throughout the various prefectures. As we go through a lot of these environmental impact assessments, there is obviously a lot of concern by local communities about the impacts of offshore wind farm, particularly the fisheries. Having better promotion and better information available in Japanese to these communities would certainly help reduce some of the burden on developers to constantly be able to constantly, how do I say, have to cover the cost of that sort of level of communication. I think with the government strategy supporting or subsidizing some of the associations to undertake that outreach would be very, very helpful for the market in general. Perhaps interestingly, for some of the OEMs, the big turbine suppliers, there has been a limited number of turbine suppliers once you get to large scale offshore wind farms, and that sort of, you would know the three majors. But there are a lot of Japanese turbines out there that have been operating for some time, allowing those turbines to also enter the market. And I'm aware of 1 3 megawatt turbine that has received its certification here in Japan. So that is good news on the cost side. But then geopolitically, how does that impact the risk profile of having a supplier base and a support base from China? So how does the government and the industry support that sort of evolution of having, cheaper options in the region for developers, and making sure that, not only do we get the supply from the region, but also we can develop some of the logistics and supply chain within Japan. Chinese suppliers will obviously be an interesting addition, but it will be challenging, I think, to some of the local communities on how they're going to sort of interface with that supply chain and whether they can actually deploy some of their equipment here and manufacture it here in Japan as well. COVID and other issues have highlighted how difficult it was to get engineers from overseas into Japan, for example, blade repairs and sort of logistics work with vessels. So having incentives to build up better training facilities for the local communities and engineers and building engineers in Japan will be very, very helpful for us long term. Having a strong domestic talent pool will be something that all developers, I think, would want to see in Japan. And I think with the offshore floating, Japan could create a center of excellence for the region and be very proactive in promoting that across Asia Pacific. And there's a lot of opportunities for them in doing that. So I think to wrap up just there, definitely a holistic view from the Japanese government, looking at the associations and how we can better deploy them and get them more support. And on a technical level, trying to find better cost bases that can support developers in obviously delivering these projects in a timely way, but also making sure that they're maintained and operated at a very reasonable cost level. A couple of thoughts there, and I'll give it back to you. I don't know if anybody's got any specific questions on that later, but there's perhaps a lot to unpack there.
Yes, a couple of things from my side. If you have any questions, please remember you can write it on the chat. And I think this particular question I have just posed to Roland was broad and very well answered by him, but I'm wondering if any of the panelists wants to add something or give their own opinion on that regard, or is that fine, or you want to comment something? If it's fine, I will briefly comment from my side. I fully agree with what you mentioned, Roland, particularly also with the synergies we see in Europe with this kind of market. It's good to have several areas in which you can rely, and having this kind of geopolitical issue that we have in Japan. In our case, for example, for ocean winds will be good as we have projects in Korea, having the synergies, as we mentioned, also with the vessels and the flexibility more on the cabotage side that is not there right now. So I look forward as developers on that regard. We are also looking, and I think I forgot to ask one important question on the finance side, and I would like to ask this to Hiroshi-san. Relating something that we are seeing in the news every single day almost during the last year, which is inflation. We're seeing high inflation, more in one country than the others, but I think that affects the whole commodities and supply chain. So I'm wondering, Hiroshi-san, what do you think about it, and how will it affect that, or may affect that, the offshore wind industry in Japan?
Yeah, to be honest, actually, I have no clear, resolution for that. Actually, just I would like to mention the only concern, actually the impact of inflation and connection with supply chain, as we mentioned in the previous session, is very important right now. So we are concerned the economics of a project is deteriorating due to soaring material prices and transportation costs and depreciation of Japanese yen. For example, recently we often witness turbine supply agreements provide escalation clauses based on price increase of raw materials and manufactured goods, even during the period of construction, which means cost is not fixed at finance flows. So that's a reality which we are facing, actually. At this moment, is that. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah.
At this stage, I think, please, organizers, if I'm wrong, let me know, but I don't see any question on the chat, so I will just pause and give, we have still some minutes, so it will have to be briefly, like 1 minute, something like that. A very broad question, but will be, from each of the panelists, I would like to have an answer. Where do you see Japan offshore market in 5 or 10 years? Maybe in 2030 is the year that the government decide to put for the targets of 10 gigawatt. Many of us believe it is very, very good to have a target, but difficult maybe to achieve. So I would like to hear, maybe in the same order we start with introductions, maybe first from Nakayama-san about that. What do you think about what expectations for 2030?
All right, so 2030, the quantified target might not be achieved. However, by 2040 or 2050, I believe the target of like a 45 gigawatt would be achievable by floating application. So I think it's critical, something critical is how quickly we can shift to the floating wind farm. So that is like one of the, may not be 2030, but we can be achievable by 2040 or 2050 if we bring floating application quickly. That's my view.
Thank you very much. Shall we move now to Roland again?
Certainly. I'd like to be polyamish and be very positive about 10 gigawatts by 2030, but I think it's going to be very, very difficult to be realist. I think we'll hit somewhere close to maybe 2 if everything goes right. I think the bidding and tendering process has been fairly aggressive. So the prices for the development, for the energy and the FIP has meant that it's sort of the price point has sort of slowed down that development, I believe, because the supply chain isn't there yet to support some of the targets that that the tenderers are going to have to tender at. So I think that because of those factors and just the evolution of the supply chain does take time. If you look at the European model, for example, it took at least 5-6 years before it started to get some very aggressive low levelized cost of energy levels. I think 10 gigawatts is going to be very, very challenging. Long term, it's a very attractive market, very stable. A lot of demand, being the third biggest economy. And I think in terms of energy security, you have a sovereign risk there, which is very stable. So I do believe that the Japanese government will continue to support both floating and fixed base offshore for some time in the future.
Thank you very much, Roland. I think very briefly, maybe I'm asking you to do it in 30 seconds, something like that. Saito-san, if you can give your opinion on the 2030 expectations.
Yeah, so I totally agree with the matters or challenges today all panelists raised. So I'd like to address the positive side. Now government is thinking about central scheme to introduce for the offshore wind project, and that would be accelerate introducing offshore wind project And also today, Roland went through all the challenges in the development phase. But I'd like to mention your company successfully overcome in the Ishikawa project all the development challenges, and now construction is going successfully. That was fantastic. And I think such a great player with experience to develop in Japanese offshore wind project would lead the Japanese market lead successful. And several panelists mentioned such a combination with experienced players bringing to the single project will make happen, I believe. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, so apologies for that. Briefly, Hiroshi-san.
Okay. So yeah, although there may still be a few offshore wind projects in operation at the time, we hope that many projects will be under construction, and that a larger number of offshore wind projects totaling around 2 to 3 gigawatts will be put up for tender every year. To that end, it will be necessary to solve issues that we not discussed today, such as strengthening and enhancement of power grids and transmission lines. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, indeed, we haven't touched that topic, which is very relevant if we want to. I mean, the grid is a very, very important part. I think we didn't have enough time to touch on that particular aspect. So thank you so much. And we have finished on time, exactly on time. I don't know if the organizers want to provide some final words, but at least from the panelists and myself, thank you very much for staying there and hearing our panel. And to the panelists, thank you for your time and sharing your experience and knowledge. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for Mr. Pelao hosting this excellent panel discussion, and also appreciate Sato-san, Nakayama-san, Iwan-san, and Mr. Roland's sharing. This panel is full of information and also give us confidence about the market and bring more thoughts. As much as I want to continue talking with you, but this is end. Once again, I sincerely appreciate all the speakers today for preparing the speeches in your busy schedules, and also thanks for accompanying of our audience. Today's recording, along with a short recap, will be sent to our registrants this Friday. If you have any comments, please feel free to drop me a message at the below contact. Today's Impact is also the prelude conference of our 5th Japan Wind Energy 2023. The exhibition could present your business at the forefront of the hottest wind market. Will take place in Tokyo, Japan on October 17 to 18. We also look forward to your participation. Thank you very much. This is all for today's Impact Live, and we believe that wind energy in Japan will continue to grow in future. See you next time.